I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the Director of Cyber Initiatives here at the Aspen Institute, and I am joined by my friend and brilliant national security scholar, Mary McCord, the former Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security in the Justice Department, and who has been working actively this year on the challenges of street protests, the intersection of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. And I'm really excited to have a conversation with her today about how this might unfold after the election, sort of the challenges that we might see in the streets of America after the results on November 3rd, or potentially just as challenging the lack of results on November 3rd, as we might actually face an election period after Election Day, where for hours, days, or even a week or two, we might still be counting votes across the country and wondering who the winner of the 2020 presidential election is actually going to be. So Mary, thanks so much for joining me today and joining the Aspen Ideas Now Forum. Let me start by asking you a little bit about your work so far this year and how you have seen these questions about street protests, both on the Black Lives Matter side and then the right-wing militias who have been protesting stay-at-home orders, and the intersection of the two.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here, even though the topic is sobering. So first, for the last 3 years, my current organization, the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law, has been involved in protest work. And by that, I mean legal work surrounding protests and how to protect public safety while preserving constitutional rights. First Amendment rights, Second Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights. We brought a case after Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally against the militia and white supremacist groups that really invaded Charlottesville, in some cases heavily armed, usurping law enforcement and legitimate National Guard authority and arrogating to themselves where and under what circumstances they would deploy lethal force. In the wake of that, we've worked with local jurisdictions, large and small, across the country to help them prepare for protests and demonstration and rallies where they have reason to believe violence might break out the way we saw in Charlottesville. And in doing that, we put together a pretty lengthy sort of guidebook called Protest and Public Safety, a guide to cities and citizens, to help local jurisdictions and concerned residents and activists understand like what measures can be taken lawfully to ensure that people are able to freely exercise First Amendment rights without being intimidated by violence, without being having a peaceful protest turn into a violent melee, and that sort of thing. Now, since the George Floyd killing earlier this year and during the pandemic, we've seen, rather than what we had seen over the last 3 years, is oftentimes we'd get a phone call from a city manager or a city attorney saying, the KKK is planning to do a march here, or a neo-Nazi group is planning to do a march here. We think counter-protesters will come. What can we do? Now what we're seeing in the wake of the George Floyd killing is racial justice protests around the country, Black Lives Matter and other racial justice protests, and the militias are coming out in the face of those racial justice protests, often based on false rumors that violent anarchists are coming to their town. They're calling themselves forth ostensibly to what they would call protect private property, protect statues, sometimes like Confederate statues, other statues, and sometimes they'll even say to protect the protesters. But the result is they come heavily armed, often in full military garb, bearing, and when I say armed, I'm talking about usually long arms, assault rifles, AR-15s and the like, multiple extra magazines with ammunition, flak jackets, combat boots, etc. And they're coordinating their activity, taking up posts oftentimes at different corners, different intersections, again, ostensibly to protect private businesses, private property, public property, but the reality is they're an incredibly intimidating presence when we're talking about people trying to engage in the peaceful exercise of their First Amendment rights.
And one of the things that I think is interesting in your work is so much in the political debate, we sort of think of or hear about the Second Amendment being all but unchallengeable. That the idea of the right to bear arms, allows people to do that anywhere that it is not prohibited by, concealed carry or open carry laws in a jurisdiction. But the way that you approach it and the way that you've approached these cases actually adds some interesting nuance to this, right? Mm-hmm. that these protests and counter protests by these militia groups actually sort of tip over from what we would consider sort of individual rights to bear arms and into the more complex and nuanced area of militia law.
As I was indicating in my response earlier, recently now we're seeing more and more militias ostensibly sort of, pretending to sort of augment police forces. And in that respect, they do usurp actual, legitimate law enforcement authority and militia authority. And they will often claim, well, they have authority to do that because they are a militia, and militia, after all, is used in the Second Amendment. And they will say, that's our claim. And it's used in the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, and it's also used in most state constitutions. But the US Constitution and most state constitutions define that militia as all able-bodied residents between certain ages, usually it's 17 to 45, who are then available to be called forth by the government in defense of the state. So in the case of the United States, it's Congress under the Constitution that has the authority to call forth the militia, meaning call forth all able-bodied residents, actually the US Constitution says men, able-bodied men in service and in defense of the United States. They would then report to the commander-in-chief, the president. It doesn't enable able-bodied residents, men or women, to call themselves forth or activate themselves when they think there's something that requires their attention. Same in the states. The states will often refer to a militia the same way, able-bodied residents between certain ages. And then in most states, it's the governor or the governor's designee that has the power under state constitution and state statutory law to activate that group of able-bodied residents in defense of the state. So all states have a National Guard, which is always available to be activated. And the idea of the militia, meaning all other able-bodied residents, is if that National Guard isn't enough, and if they need more defense of the state against foreign adversaries, they can call them forth. The last thing that the states, as they were forming their own governments and writing their own constitutions, the last thing they wanted to worry about would be rogue militias, rogue private armies that might actually threaten the state. So one of the things we're seeing now, not only in this, unlawful exercise of law enforcement authority that they do not have under federal or state constitutions by private unauthorized militias, we're also sometimes seeing them actually activate themselves, not just to sort of protect and preserve and defend, but to actually push back against what they will sometimes call the tyranny of the state. So for example, we saw in Michigan and Ohio earlier this year, and we've seen it in Idaho and other places, militias gathering to actually, march on and in some cases invade into state houses, as in Michigan, while heavily armed, in order to protest stay-at-home orders, masking orders, other public safety measures that governors have taken, and really flex their muscle against the state. So out of that sort of more defensive posture of, oh, we're here to augment law enforcement, we're here to protect property, and into a much more offensive posture. So this is dangerous regardless of what form it takes, because not only does it, intimidate and coerce those who it's directed at in its offensive posture, it even in a defensive sort of protect property posture, it intimidates those who are seeking to peacefully protest. It heightens tensions, and it tends to make everyone in the situation more aggressive. And that includes counter-protesters, that includes hangers-on, like in Kenosha. It remains to be seen whether the young man who fatally shot 2 people and seriously injured another, whether he was technically a member of the Kenosha Civil Guard, the private unauthorized militia, or whether he was hanger-on. But either way, it doesn't matter, because it's that militia activity, that heavily armed, organized use of force by those without any authority to use it in violation of state laws, because all states prohibit private paramilitary activity, in violation of state law, that makes things so incredibly dangerous and results in tragedies, as we've seen in Kenosha, Albuquerque, and elsewhere.
So let's sort of take this now and apply this to what we might see in the streets after after the November election. Either Wednesday after either an uncertain election result or an election result where one side or the other believes was not legitimate. I think one of the things that is so important to remember as we head into this election, that elections in a democracy are not about necessarily counting the votes to declare the winner. It's about running a process that is fair enough and secure enough that the loser considers it legitimate, that the loser and their supporters agree that they lost. And I think one of the things that a lot of people are increasingly concerned about for this November is the possibility that one side or the other will view that loss as illegitimate. So talk to me a little bit about how you might see these militias play out post-election this year, and particularly sort of what would be the remedy for the state or the federal government to try to clamp down on armed protests? So,
let's start with, first of all, the kinds of attacks we're already seeing on the election even before it has started. We're seeing the current president tweeting, and some members of his administration suggesting that mail-in voting is, ripe for the potential for fraud, suggesting that any delay in counting the ballots is equal to fraud and must mean that the election is rigged, and all of this type of buildup of disinformation about the legitimacy of the election. So couple that with times in the past where this president has called on, only very thinly veiled, call on the militias to take action, and they've responded. And you can see the potential there for militias to respond if they believe that the election results are illegitimate. For example, we saw in November of 2018 when the president was complaining about an invasion across our southwestern border from Latin communities and migrants, and he called forth the military to augment the Customs and Border Patrol at the border. Then militia groups, the Minuteman Project and others, called on militia members to come forth from across the country and go down to the border and again, supplement our troops and supplement Customs and Border Patrol. And some of those groups did go, and in some cases, the case of the United Constitutional Patriots, they actually decamped on the border with New Mexico and between New Mexico and Mexico, unlawfully detained migrants who crossed the border and held them for Customs and Border Patrol without any authority whatsoever. These are just private individuals with big guns who take it upon themselves to go engage in law enforcement activity. Now, one of their members has been prosecuted for just that, falsely assuming the functions of a federal governmental official, but too often this goes, without any consequences. We've seen other cases when the impeachment investigation was going on and the president retweeted some tweets of others who were talking about impeachment, if it were to result in the removal of the president, being something that might trigger a civil war. And we saw the president retweet this, and then we saw other militia groups, including the Oath Keepers, say, "We are ready, call us forth when you need us, we are trained, the AR-15 is our weapon of choice." Now, I almost hate saying this on a public recording like this because I certainly don't want to suggest that this is definitely going to happen, encourage it to happen, scare people or anything like that. But I think we do have to be prepared for the possibility that if private, unauthorized, but heavily armed militias do not perceive the result as legitimate, they could take action in the streets. Likewise, if the results of the election go the other way and the president, wins the election, but those on the other side believe it's illegitimate, I don't see as much of a risk of militias taking to the streets, because there are very few militias on the left. There are some, but there are few. But there could well be protests if the view is that the election is not legitimate. There could be protests in the streets, which would then draw out militias on the other side. So, I do think there is a potential for political violence and certainly threats of political violence. And so a couple of points I think are worth emphasizing. Every state in the country has provisions on its books, whether in its own state constitution or its criminal laws, that prohibit private militia activity, private paramilitary activity, and that type of usurpation of law enforcement authority. So it's not every state has every single provision, but every state has something. And we know that these are lawful in the face of a Second Amendment challenge, because the Supreme Court made clear back in 1886 and reaffirmed in 2008 that the Second Amendment does not prevent states from prohibiting private paramilitary organizations. Now, there are a lot of things about the Second Amendment that remain gray areas, the exact extent to which states can regulate gun ownership and transfer and types of guns, things like that. But this part has been clear. The Supreme Court in 2008, when it held that what we know the Second Amendment protects is an individual right to bear arms for one's own individual self-protection, in that same opinion, it reaffirmed its 1886 holding that it does not protect private paramilitary organizations. So for whatever the other gray areas are, it doesn't protect this. And unfortunately, there's been a mythology really about the Second Amendment that has become very well entrenched over the last several decades, by which even many law enforcement in the US think that this militia, the right to be a militia, particularly in an open carry state, is somehow protected by the Second Amendment, and it is not. And so if in preparing for the potential for militia activity post-election and even pre-election, is very important for state and local law enforcement to get a better understanding, not only in the laws in their individual states that bar this type of private militia activity, but also an understanding that it is not protected by the Second Amendment.
It's a great point for you to raise, Mary, and thanks so much for joining us to talk about it. It's sort of a fascinating challenge legally between now and the election, and then after the election, to sort of think back about how we need to go really 140 years back into our jurisprudence to even begin to understand what's unfolding right now.
Thank you. It's my pleasure being here.